How you guys doing? Hi, everybody.
Jason,
hey, man.
Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me back.
I love having you here.
Oh, thanks, dude.
Every conversation with you is what you would describe a shot of awe for me.
I do appreciate that. I had a great time with you last time, so it's really great to be back. Thank you.
You are in the midst, or you just finished this massive speaking tour that you were doing in both Canada and Australia.
That's
and
right.
For the first time, it was the kind of speaking tour that was like a rock band tour, right?
Kind of, exactly. I told people I feel like I'm a performer in a band now. It was kind of a revelation for me because, as you know, I've been doing TV for a long time. I did Brain Games for 5 seasons. I did Origins, and then I've been doing all this digital media. The shots of awe, the videos, and I do a lot of corporate speaking for many years. I've been speaking about disruptive innovation and technology and AI and everything they're talking about in Silicon Valley because I've made videos about it that are really, I guess, that inspire people a lot. I get booked in the corporate speaking space, which is...
Specifically Silicon Valley corporate speaking?
Yeah, but also all over the world, like Dubai and other places. But it's, it's for Microsoft, it's for Intel, it's for Oracle, it's the tech companies. And so it's a particular type of audience. They know the lingo, I inspire them, and so on and so forth. But I've never done something that's actually open to the public in the sense of the people that actually watch my content online. And the videos that I actually do, there is a lot of stuff about tech, but I do a lot of videos about altered states of consciousness. I do a lot of videos about creativity. I do a lot of videos about interpersonal relationships, the human condition, existentialism. And these much broader topics, I really never thought that there was a kind of an audience to speak to this, you know what I mean? I thought of myself as the tech corporate speaker guy. And so I was contacted by this organizer in Canada who was like, I'd love to organize a tour with you. Not a corporate stuff, but like, Jason Silva live. I was like, I was kind of intimidated because I was like, oh, that means we have to sell tickets. That means we have to fill up this auditorium. What if it doesn't work out? But, they felt pretty confident that there was an audience for this stuff. And so, yeah, we had over 1,000 people in Vancouver and Toronto and Kelowna, and same in Sydney and Melbourne. And I got to tell you, it was a revelation. Because as you say, like you're in a band, like when you go on stage with an audience that's already resonated with your content, people who already dig what you have to say, the level of comfort that you feel when you step on the stage is a whole different game. You almost feel like a comedian because they laugh at everything you say.
You probably feel like you can play a little bit more with your words and play with what you're talking about rather than in a corporate environment where it's like, this is intentional and this is the action that you need to take.
Correct. When you're addressing a corporate audience, you got to establish credibility for the first 10 minutes of the talk. So it's like, let's talk about technology. And again, I have a very kind of philosophical and broad interpretation of technological trends. I think of technology as an extension of human creativity, an embodiment of human agency in the world. This sounds really metaphysical, but I back it up with these facts like, well, technology is accelerating at an exponential rate, and the smartphone in our pocket is 1,000,000 times cheaper and 1,000,000 times smaller and 1,000 times more powerful than what used to be a supercomputer that was half a building. So I got the facts to establish credibility, but still, that's kind of a stressful 10 minutes. Because you got to establish credibility so that the audience takes you seriously, and then you can take them on a magic carpet ride of a talk. Whereas when you're dealing with an audience of people that already resonated with your content, like you say, then you can get real personal right off the bat. You can step on the stage and be like, wow, thank you guys for being here. Where does this all begin for me? What is the origin of my work? If you guys have resonated with my content, you probably want to know that. So then we can get into the meat of it, which is, where does this compulsion for creativity come from? What is the origin story of our creative drive, of the fire in our belly? And then this gets into the whole thing we were talking about backstage, which is, existential angst and the compulsion to create. So.
Did you find when you set out on this tour and people were buying tickets that you needed to change the performance itself, not just in terms of being more personal, but did you want to bring videos and slides and like almost have a band with you or something?
Yeah, so I always use my videos in lieu of like typical slides when I do a presentation. And so I think the result feels like very much like a multimedia show. My videos are short, but they're great material to break up a 30 or 40-minute keynote, because every 8-10 minutes you can show something astounding. But again, when you're dealing with an audience that knows your work, I can go much broader, so that the topics of the videos that I was showing can deal with things such as anxiety and depression. I'm quite passionate, as you know, about mental health. I remember reading a statistic recently from the United Nations that said that 800,000 people a year now are committing suicide across the world. And that is a larger number than the amount of people that die from armed conflict and natural disasters combined. So that means like all the terrorism, all the earthquakes, all the fires, all the tragedy, right, around the world doesn't add up in numbers to the amount of people that are killing themselves, okay? So that's a big deal, you know? I've always had an interest in the human condition and the existential anxiety of being mortal beings who crave the infinite, right? That we literally exist at the interplay between the finite and the infinite. And one of my heroes is this psychologist, Ernest Becker. He wrote the book, The Denial of Death, which basically distills the human condition to the fact that we are uniquely aware of our mortality and that is the drive and the source of our angst, our malaise, but also our creativity. This is powerful stuff, but not really what you're talking to a corporate audience about that wants to hear about disruptive innovation. Now, I love disruptive innovation, but the reason that we're constantly innovating and disrupting is because we want to overcome our boundaries and redefine our limits. And that compulsion comes from the fact that we feel very small in the cosmos, according to the work of Ernest Becker. So getting to talk about this in these lectures open to the public, I mean, it was really a much bigger riff for me. Just creatively, it was just like a dance. I never experienced anything like it. You know, I never even envisioned something like that for myself.
Do you ever feel the constant disruptive technology that we're talking about, as much as technology is an extension of sort of human impulse and agency, has an unintended consequence causing the anxiety and depression in some ways that's leading to the 800,000 suicides?
Oh, you're saying that one of the unintended consequences of our technological innovation is that now the technology itself is causing more anxiety? Yeah. Well, that's a very interesting thing, you know, because, I mean, now we're getting weird. But yes, look, you know, like Carrie Fisher used to say, take your broken heart, turn it into art. Ernest Becker used to say the difference between the neurotic and the artist or the creative is that the neurotic is precisely the one who cannot create. And so he chokes on his introversions. Whereas the artist or the creative or the entrepreneur, he takes in the world, is overwhelmed by the world, but then he uses that intensity of experience that he takes in and he reworks it into his active work project, whether it's starting a company to change the world, planting his flag, you know, like tattooing his name on the tree, like creating something artful in the world. Now, it just so happens that a lot of our creativity, a lot of our culture making in the world now is happening in the form of technological disruption. And the fact that information technologies advance at this like exponential rate, whereas we continue to have these brains that think about change in a linear fashion, means that we're constantly being bombarded and overwhelmed by our own creativity. Our own capacity to create has exceeded our capacity to assimilate to our new creations. And so, perhaps to answer your question, one of the unintended consequences of our immensely sophisticated smartphones, or extensions of our cognition as I think of them, is that we have designed them to be really sticky and engage with our dopamine system in the way a slot machine does. And because we're wired for novelty, when you have a device in your pocket that's offering you 1,000 signals of new every minute, that is overwhelming, and that causes a tremendous amount of bandwidth anxiety.
It also causes a form of, I think, claustrophobia as well, which I think ties into how you discuss people handling mental health right now with a certain amount of awe, as you would say.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that the solution to technologies and to innovation that is disruptive is to figure out ways of developing these tools and technologies to make them better. So the solution is not necessarily to become a Luddite and to renounce these tools and technologies, but rather to continue to reform them and build upon them. You know, that's always the solution, is better tech. Tech and innovation and creativity, look, it's always a double-edged sword, right? When we domesticated fire, as we talked about in my show Origins, fire cooked our foods and changed humanity, but fire can also burn a village or burn California like happening right now. So, you know, because technology has always been a double-edged sword, I think we have to be a little bit more like judicious and mindful and kind of pay attention to how we use these tools to extend our cognitive capacities and extend our impulses and amplify our impulses, but to do so in a way that takes into account the world, the people that we love, and the consequences of our actions, if that makes sense. But then getting into the other topic that you're talking about, the sort of the power of awe. Look, I think some technologies can amplify our capacity to experience awe and wonder, and I think that others don't. You know, when you think of something like the Hubble Space Telescope, I mean, that's very different than a sticky app on your smartphone. That's like hijacking your...
I was going to say, how often do you experience awe like this versus like this, you know?
Yeah, well, fair enough. I mean, look, this is a rudimentary interface. I think when we have like full immersive virtual reality technologies that can engender stages of illumination for ourselves, that will be game-changing. But I also think it's important for us not to just think of all technologies as smartphones and computers, right? You know, Kevin Kelly, who started Wired magazine, he famously used to say, if we didn't invent the technology of the oil painting in time for Van Gogh, or if we didn't invent the technology of the musical instrument in time for Beethoven, if we didn't invent the technology of the written word or spoken language in time for Shakespeare, you know, like think of technology as a scaffolding that allows for new forms of human creativity in the world, right? And so what then excites me is what new tools will emerge that will allow for new forms of human beauty. And then we can sort of get into the whole thing about awe.
Well, when we talk about awe, and awe as a relief for forms of anxiety and depression, one of the things that you talk about a lot is sort of psychedelic therapy. And I think what's so interesting about psychedelic therapy is that it's still kind of removing yourself from a life of technology or surrounded by technology and replanting yourself in a moment of experiencing the world alone opening up for you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think what's happening right now in mental health is really fascinating. And this is not to say that the answer to the angst caused by technologies that are perhaps overwhelming us because we're not using them judiciously or properly is to disconnect completely.
I agree.
But perspective can be gained from broadening our perspective or changing our perception of reality or distancing ourselves from the day-to-day things that we're engaging with. And this is where I think psychedelic psychotherapy is so fascinating. So Johns Hopkins University, Imperial College of London, and other research facilities are now working with patients in guided controlled settings and giving people who have, again, treatment-resistant anxiety and depression caused by whatever it is, the brokenness of the modern world, if you call it. And again, giving them psychedelics in these guided environments is having a success rate of something like 80%, like insane in a single session. You know, I know that the FDA recently designated MDMA, again, the active ingredient in the club drug ecstasy, which was originally, by the way, used for couples therapy. Most people don't know that. But it was just designated a
Still be.
Yeah. Breakthrough therapy. It was designated a breakthrough therapy for stage 3 clinical trials by the FDA. And this is all thanks to the work of MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, led by the brilliant Rick Doblin. The point is this, again, 1 or 2 sessions with people who have served in war, people who have PTSD, people who have anxiety, panic disorder, single session. They no longer meet the criteria for PTSD. And the way it seems to do this is by putting people in what's known as an optimal arousal zone. And it does this by dampening activity in the amygdala, which is the fear center of the brain, boosting activity in the frontal cortex, making you more engaged because it's a stimulant, while paradoxically making you feel relaxed. So that sweet spot, that Goldilocks zone for psychotherapy, they call the optimal arousal zone for transformation to take place, because it allows for what's called cognitive reframing. It allows you to revisit the source of your trauma, look at the things in your life that you're not comfortable with facing, whether it's something horrific that happened to you in the past or something that's just not working in your life right now but that you're normally pushing under the rug, and really be in an open enough state to look at it, but with your fear response dampened enough for you to not freak out and recoil at, you know, once it all gets laid down at the table. And during these moments, then what happens is you can reframe the situation, come to peace with the situation, have your catharsis, whatever it may be. But then it allows you to digest that experience and actually relegate it to memory instead of trauma, which is like stuck in your solar plexus. In any case, something as transformative as this, and I believe these tools, these psychotropics, they're technologies too. Because again, my view of technology is much broader than just our smartphones. I think it was an anthropologist called Eliade. He used to call them techniques of ecstasy. And they've been used by shamanic cultures all over the world for thousands of years for that very reason, because they are technologies that allow us to realign the psyche. But again, they are delicate tools, you know, just like you don't want to fly an airplane unless the pilot's been very, very well trained and the aircraft's been very, very well maintained. I think it's the same thing with these tools and technologies. I think what happened in the 1960s is that it got a little too out of control. You know, it became too much like, you know, just tune in, turn out, drop out, or whatever the Timothy Leary quote was. But I think what's happening now is a much more responsible approach to it. In fact, Michael Pollan from The Omnivore's Dilemma, one of the most brilliant writers, he wrote that article in The New Yorker 2 years ago about these psychedelic studies, about how game-changing they were. It was called The Trip Treatment. And since then, he's gone down the rabbit hole. He has a new book coming out in May called How to Change Your Mind. And it's all about his deep dive, both in the third person and the first person, into the world of psychedelic psychotherapy. But where does this ultimately lead us? Well, it leads us to a place, hopefully, to address the root cause of our existential malaise, which is, how do we make peace with our place in the cosmos? You know, whether your thing is religion or spirituality, or you're a secular scientist, we're creatures of mind and meaning. And it seems that these tools, as John Duty wrote, recontextualize the self as a marvelous conduit in a timeless whole from which molecules and meanings flow from neurons to nebula and back again. That kind of a mystical experience, that kind of an inverse PTSD experience, that kind of experience that cracks you open seems to absolve us of our ache and agony and existential distress. And so if we can alleviate human suffering with these safe tools and technologies that we can utilize under guided, controlled conditions, how dare we deny ourselves that?
Does it have to be under guided control conditions?
Well, look, people go to Burning Man and do it their own way too. But
what do you think about the recent trend? Is probably the wrong word, but of people microdosing. You know, there was that really wonderful New York Times article from a few months ago that was like this woman who's a writer who was having trouble with depression over the past few years and started microdosing with LSD on like a daily or bi-weekly basis.
For sure, there's a researcher called James Fadiman who has been researching this for a long time as well. Look, I think there's definitely something to it. I remember reading an interesting article that was saying that we have these kind of mapped byways in our brain. It's called the default mode network. The default mode network is kind of like the autobiographical mind, the voice in your head that lets you know that you exist, otherwise known as the ego, that sense of bounded autonomy that we have, and that we need to function in the world to a certain extent, you know, so we don't get run over by a car when we cross the street. It's like body integrity, sense of self, agency, all important. But when the default mode network becomes overactive, when it feels under threat, it becomes like a terrible tyrant, as David Foster Wallace used to say. And both anxiety and depression are associated with heightened overactivity of the default mode network. So literally, it's overactive, you know? And so people need to shut that down to find relief from themselves. What psychedelics do, what all altered states of consciousness do, is shut down default mode network activity. When you shut down default mode network activity, just like when you're in a flow state as an athlete, or if you're a writer in the zone, or when you're doing one of these shows and time flies by because you're so tapped in, what's happening is the experience is like the doer and the seer merge. Your sense of self disappears and you're completely immersed in the now. Your sense of time disappears. All these things change. That's because the default mode network is essentially shut down. And during these moments, we find relief from our monkey mind. And now all of a sudden, pattern recognition goes up, creativity goes up, empathy goes up, risk-taking goes up, and we're also open to new experience. We're more open than we usually are. Our defense mechanisms fall away because the protective ego dissolves, right? This is like psychotherapy, because these mapped byways in our minds is like the freeway that we always take to work, the normal way that our brain functions. The default mode network is like the highway, the 5-lane highway. You shut down the 5-lane highway, what happens? The cars have to take all these alternate routes to get home. And that alternate route might be amazing, it might be really boring, but it'll be new and it'll be different. So that's what seems to happen to brain activity. They did fMRI scans of people in these altered states of consciousness, and brain activity is totally different when the default mode network gets shut down. Different parts of the brain talk to each other. So look, we might decide in the end that this is something you only want to do once in your life or once a year, or maybe not at all for some people. But the point is, there needs to be more research. You know, like to have hurdles, to have restrictions that get in the way of chasing what could be, in the words of Stanislav Grof, potentially a telescope for psychiatry. You know, what the telescope did for astronomy, these tools could do for psychiatry. I think it's a responsibility for all of us. And also, you know, you design better minds, and then these minds can then make better decisions in the world and make better tools in the world to serve those minds. You know, another company that's doing great work in this space, and I did a video for them, full disclosure, because I really support their work, is Neurohacker Collective. And these guys are interested in cognitive upgrades, building better systems for better minds. So first you upgrade cognition, and then you start upgrading the systems within which cognition is nested. So society, identity, culture, all these things, and you sort of move towards a space of like upgrading humanity. You know, neurohacking is the name of this field, and it's really it's exciting stuff. I mean, there's a lot of stuff happening, but
is it
room for it's good to be optimistic, I think.
Well, that was my next question for you. Is it easier or harder for you to talk about these sort of existential, metaphysical subjects when it feels like, I think for a lot of us, the practical life of our day-to-day is threatened, almost on an hourly, every other hour basis, it feels like. A new threat, a new disgusting thing has come out, and we're just all kind of trying to get by.
Yeah, like it's a blessing and a curse, right? I mean, something like social media, you know, nobody would argue that it opens us up to so many different perspectives, and it frees us all to have a voice, and it allows communication to transcend top-down hierarchical systems, and this is amazing. But social media can be weaponized, and it can create fake news halos, and it can, like, again, lead to all these unintended consequences we didn't think of. But we learn from what doesn't work, and we address it, and it's all being addressed right now. One of the other side effects as we address the unintended consequences of our tools and technologies and the level of distress that they're causing us is also that we forget that the macro trends overall across the world have been improving steadily for decades. You know, you look at the work of Steven Pinker, the myth of violence, the better angels of our nature. You know, the world is actually less violent today than it's ever been before. The chances of a person dying at the hands of another person are the lowest than they've ever been before. So whereas there are things we have to deal with. There are problems in the world, and politics has become particularly toxic. You know, we're due for a redemption for sure. But I think there's also a simultaneous awakening happening. Like, we're having all these breakthrough clinical trials using psychedelics. We're having all these breakthroughs in innovation and technology and artificial intelligence that are going to allow us to optimize the world in ways we never could. You know, Yuval Harari, the author of *Sapiens*, had this wonderful article in The Guardian about finding meaning in an age without work. Because, you know, automation and robotics and AI, yes, it's going to replace the jobs. Like, it's going to make a lot of jobs obsolete, no doubt. And so then but then the question becomes then philosophical, because then it's not about the job, because when we have universal basic income and when we have nanotechnology and biotechnology and all these tools and technologies to be able to give us what we need, we're still going to need meaning. And for many people, being busy substitutes for meaning. For some people, their job is their meaning and their purpose and their map of meaning in the world, and it orients themselves. For other people, it's just a way to fill the time so that the existential dread can be kept at bay. So we're going to have to start asking this metaphysical, philosophical question a lot more as these disruptions continue, the jobs disappear, and we have to ask ourselves, who are we and what are we and where are we going and what do we want to be? You know, and so this is where all this stuff about like psychedelics and consciousness and neurohacking and cognitive upgrades come into play. We ourselves need to evolve at the same speed as our technologies and innovations are evolving.
Do you believe that when the jobs disappear, that society will step in and provide a basic economy for those who are not working? We don't seem to be heading in that direction.
Yeah. Look,
I mean, at least in this fucking country.
You know, I spent a lot of time in Scandinavia. I love the Netherlands. What a country, you know, and Denmark, Copenhagen. Now, these places
value education.
Not only is education free and among the best in the world, they also have healthcare that is completely free and amazing. These are people that are considered some of the happiest people in the world. And there's a social contract. You and me were talking about Canada before. There's a sense of we. not just I. There's a sense that, I am because you are, and so if everybody's doing okay, we all thrive a little bit more. This is very different from the totalitarian Marxism of the Soviet Union. I mean, these are still creative, free enterprise, capitalist economies with private property and all that jazz. I mean, you go to the Netherlands, it's one of the most competitive economies in the world, and they have a lot of startups, and it's an amazing culture, but then they also take care of their people. Education and healthcare is a right, a fundamental human right. And for that reason, I think people have that cushion. There's lower incidences of existential misery in a lot of ways, and a sense of community, and a sense of kinship, and a sense of we is palpably felt. I used to wonder, why do I like hanging out here so much? I supposedly live in the richest country in the world. Well, the reason I like it so much is because the people are at ease. They don't seem as anxious as the people in the New York subway, because they're not. They're riding bicycles through beautiful canals on their way to their cool office where they get to leave work at 4, and they have all these benefits. You know what I'm saying? And so maybe we could learn from these people.
I think we could.
Yeah. Glad we agree.
Let's get some questions from the audience.
I've watched a lot of your interviews, and you speak a lot about having a fear of death. And I find that it's usually people that aren't living their true passion or living with purpose that have that fear, and you seem like you're not one of those people. So my question is, why are you so scared of dying?
Well, Sheldon Solomon, who is one of the sort of professors that has carried the torch for Ernest Becker's ideas about human mortality, says the explicit awareness that you're a breathing piece of defecating meat destined to die and ultimately no more significant than a lizard or a potato is not especially uplifting. People ask me why I remember a quote like that. I'm like, because that stings. That stings, right? To have emerged from nothing, to have a name, to have consciousness of self, deep inner feeling, an excruciating inner yearning for life and self-expression, all this that we have, yet to die. So I think what happens is, even if we're living our dreams, there's a faint disquiet that insidiously creeps late at night when you hear your heartbeat against the pillow. And it's like, holy shit, I'm fragile, I'm delicate, I'm finite. And how do we bear that? How do we bear that when we can contemplate infinity? When we can sing the songs that orchestrate the universe. We can mainline space and time through the optic nerve when we stare at images of the Hubble Deep Field photographs. I mean, we're gods and worms at the same time, and that doesn't cause me peace. That causes me distress, because it's like, how do we make that? How do we fully cross over? Like to have self-awareness and to be mortal, I think is a sort of moral crime that we didn't ask. It's a criminal sentence that we're afflicted with. It's a death sentence, and we've committed no crime. That's where it comes from for me, existentially speaking.
Next question.
Hi, Jason. Hi. My name is Maria Luisa. I'm a filmmaker.
Hi.
Hi, how you doing? Good. I wanted to ask you, how can humans acquire a more equal society, but talking about the self, what the self can do to improve our world, if you want to say it in an easy way?
Well, I mean, it sounds cliche, right? But when you broaden or expand or raise your consciousness, it becomes like that South African quote, I am because you are. Astronauts talk about the overview effect. When they go into orbit, they see the Earth as a single system from space, and something shifts because now they don't identify just with the image they see in the mirror. Now they identify with the reflection of the actual planet reflecting back to them. And that causes some kind of ontological awakening, you might call it. And it seems to then implore you to serve the other as you serve yourself. And if we could somehow give more people that experience, whether it is in the realms of psychotherapy, because I personally think even well-adjusted people are still crazy. I think we're all crazy. I think we're all wounded. I think we're all a little bit broken. But I think that's a good thing. That's where the light gets in. And I think all of us, just like we learn math, we should all probably go see a shrink once in a while and talk about our inner ills so that we can then orient ourselves in the world and find a map of meaning that allows us to get up in the morning with a sense that we can contribute, People talk about passion and purpose. My friend Stephen Kotler from the Flow Genome Project, he says, if you want to figure out how to serve the world, do this. Make a list of 10 things you're really, really curious about, right? So start with that and see where some of those things overlap. 2 or 3 things you're really curious about might overlap somewhere out of those 15. And those, where there's that overlap, there's neurobiology, there's dopamine, there's obviously heightened brain activity. So then where your curiosities overlap is really a sign of where your passion is. And then you look for a need in the world that can be served by this passion, and then the passion turns into purpose. It's a very simple equation. But people who have a sense of purpose are the most satisfied people in the world. People who have a purpose and who live by that purpose, who have a noble aim, as Jordan Peterson says, and are organizing their life in a way that moves towards that aim, those are the most satisfied people in the world. They get a regular hit of what's called the helper's high. The helper's high is literally a neurochemical reward that you get when you serve someone else, when you're compassionate to somebody else. So I think it has to do with like a knobs and levers approach to deconstructing our own neurobiology and optimizing the systems in the world and the way we orient ourselves in the world to serve others and simultaneously serve our own neurobiology so that it feels good to make this a better world together.
Next question.
Hi, Jason.
Hi.
I'm Natalie, and I'm an NYU student. I'm
Hi.
a huge fan. So my question is, I'm very fascinated about how you got to where you are today, and I just wanted to ask, what are the 2 or 3 books that most changed the way that you perceive the world and the human condition, and that you can maybe credit for maybe getting you to where you are today?
Yeah, thank you for your beautiful question. Definitely Ray Kurzweil's book, The Singularity is Near, When Humans Transcend Biology. That's the book that sent me on the futurist kick, because it gave me an outlet for the existential angst that I could orient myself towards. I'm like, well, serve the world, okay, check, but like, how about like overcoming our finitude? And that book was like a plausible engineering scientific approach to engendering our own divinity. You know? And I was like, I like this book. And Kurzweil is the head of engineering at Google, okay? I mean, this is not like a self-help guru. This is like an engineer. And he's saying, yeah, we can do this together. We can cure diseases. We can reprogram our biology. We can achieve the impossible. So that book was mind-blowing. And then Ernest Becker's book, The Denial of Death, is the one that I turn to when I need to be reminded of like where all the aching agony comes from. That book just kind of sums it up for me. In fact, Woody Allen he cited Denial of Death in the movie Annie Hall. He takes her to a bookstore and he's like, you need to read this book. You'll understand my view of the world. So definitely that book. And there's a book by Eric Davis called Technosis, Myth, Magic, and Mysticism in the Age of Information, that looks at how our spiritual our urges for transcendence even manifest themselves and bleed into our hyper-rational technosphere. So even though technology is meant to be this like hyper-rational science engineering thing, that underneath, beneath the veneer of hyper-rationalism, our mystical yearnings continue to exist. In our techno world. Like we look to these things very much as salvation and portals to imaginal realms, beyond here and now. And it's a fascinating book. He's a brilliant dude.
Next question.
Hi.
Right here.
Hi, Jason. Hi, I'm Selma. They told me to stand here. It's not often that we get to stay face-to-face with someone that aspires. So first of all, thank you for the inspiration and for all your artwork into the world. And then secondly, in the landscape of kindness and empathy knowledge, I mean, we have a society full of really educated people, but lack a little bit of empathy and kindness. What's your solution? What's your recommendation from a day-to-day perspective? And then what's next for you?
To give people more empathy.
To allow people to have more empathy for the world in which we live.
Yeah, I think that we're all so stuck inside our own monkey mind that the first sort of piece of advice that I'd give somebody in order to prime them to be more open to others is to go beyond themselves. And it sounds cliche, but like when the inner chatter goes quiet, what did Jerry Garcia say? To get really high is to forget yourself, and to forget yourself is to see everything else. Now, I don't think you have to get really high necessarily, but you have to find some way to forget yourself, because it's when you forget yourself that you see everything else, And that doesn't mean be a martyr or self-sacrifice or be miserable in order to serve others. I actually mean like go beyond the inner chatter. You're still there. You're just there without your neurotic self-doubt and inner criticism and cul-de-sacs and error messages. That's what I mean by going beyond yourself.
I think we have time for one more question right here.
I would echo what she said. Thank you so much for
Thank you, bro.
for the inspiration. you have to be on so often, and when you need to access flow state, when you need to turn off the monkey mind and experience a sense of transient hypofrontality, how do you, both through routine and maybe just something in the moment, how do you do that?
Yeah, that's interesting that you hit upon that, because the videos that people seem to enjoy so much, not the stuff I've done with television, but when I'm out there making these shots of awe, what was so liberating for me is that here was a sort of craft that was using media in a way that was fully creative, fully autonomous, and on my own terms. So I didn't have to be on, because I only was making content when my neurochemistry was ready. It wasn't on someone else's schedule, it was on my own schedule. Ironically, the success of that content, right? Because that content happens when I'm in a state of absolute rhapsody and reverie. I'm riding bicycles in Amsterdam and getting in the zone and doing these riffs that people like, and so, but then it's like, oh, that's resonating online, or people are sharing that video. Let's book that guy and have
more.
him,
Do more.
Yeah. All right, Jason, be philosophical.
Find more Rhapsody.
Go.
Find more Rhapsody.
Go. And I can't tell you how tricky that is, because on the one hand, well, you got to follow the feedback you're getting from the world, right? If you're making art and the art is resonating, that's an opportunity to make more art, supposedly, right? But the pressure then to be who they need you to be on demand is tricky, especially for somebody like me, who's an introvert and is not on all the time. And my techniques for trying to manage that, number one, is the most priority for me is sleep. Sleep is like, before anything else, it's like absolute silent rest. It's the replenishing, renewing qualities of sleep I can't overemphasize. And it's funny because we live in a world where it's so cool to be like, man, I'm busy. I don't have time to sleep. I'm busy. Drinks after work, party, no. Actually, you'll function much better in the world if you're getting enough sleep, And also, time to be alone with your thoughts. Most of us are a lot of people are just kind of scared to be alone. They got to fill the time with somebody else. They got to be chatting all the time. And back to your idea about disconnecting, but I think it's really nice to be in a quiet place with your own thoughts. That's also huge, because it's renewing, it's recharging.
How often are you able to find quiet places to go? Do you find it while walking through the city, or do you have to be in an actual quiet place? I find if I walk through the city personally, if no headphones on, I will find an inner quiet.
Really?
And there's something about the sounds of the city will end up becoming almost like wonderful white noise and form a meditation for myself.
No. I mean, to me, that says that you have probably low levels of neuroticism, whereas I have very high levels of neuroticism, which means that it's difficult for me to filter out noises that are not important. So if I go to a loud restaurant, I immediately am stressed, because I'll be talking to you, but I can hear everybody else speaking, and it's difficult for me to filter that out, and it just makes my cortisol go through the roof. Same thing in hotel rooms. I need an absolutely quiet hotel room. If I hear just even a little bit of street noise, it already creates anxiety. And I have read that there's a term for misophenia or something like that. It starts with people who can't stand the sound of other people chewing, but it extends to people who can't stand just noise in general. And some creative people have this, and I sort of self-diagnosed myself with it. So I really like parks, really quiet, calm places that are very serene. And the reason is because I believe that consciousness is mediated by environment. Not just influenced by environment, but consciousness is a collaboration of self and world. And so where you are is who you are. You become what you behold.
Jason, I know the tours in Canada and Australia are over, but right? Yeah. But how can people stay plugged into Jason Silva?
Yeah, well, I can continue to be very active on Facebook and YouTube, and we're working towards creating a tour, I think, in the U.S. next year, which would be really fun as well. I'm launching 2 digital series that I'm actively working on. One is a series about how big data can help mitigate a lot of the distress we see in the world. It's called Data Makes Possible. It's with a company called Western Digital. And it's all about Internet of Things and AI and kind of making a world that works better for each individual, in the sense that the best technology is the technology that gets out of the way, not the technology that distracts. So if we could use smart tools and smart sensors deployed all over the planet to make a world that feels intuitive and kind of working with your rhythms to eliminate friction from how we interact and kind of optimize society in every level. We're doing a bunch of videos with Western Digital about that, so I'll be distributing those digitally. I'm very excited about it. Also, for my friends who speak Spanish, I did a first ever digital series in Spanish with Discovery Latin America about the relationship between travel and creativity and entrepreneurship. So we partnered with Marriott for that, and they're trying to really push this idea of innovation and travel to make you more innovative, to open up your mind to new ideas and new perspectives, and that's a huge thing for me, una oportunidad también de hablar en español para la gente, so ha sido muy chévere, yeah. So that's been great. And then actually tomorrow, you guys probably heard of this viral sensation, HQ Trivia. Yeah, so that was actually co-founded by my dear friend Russ Yusupov, and they've invited me to guest host tomorrow at 3 o'clock. So check that out if you want. Yeah. So, yeah.
All right. Well, everybody give a round of applause for Jason Silva.